Good day to you. There's a lot of talk in the US media right now about who is behind these drone strikes that hit the Saudi Arabian oil's distribution center, which has incapacitated 50% of its oil exports and resulted in an immediate increase of 25 cents per gallon at the pump right now. And there are some fingers being pointed at Iran. And in fact, Iran is being talked about by quite a few policy corners in Washington as being a country that is an agitator that the U.S. may want to consider a military strike against. Yeah, it's happening right now. But what can you really tell me about Iran other than that? Can you tell me about some basic things? Like, did you know Iran used to be Persia? Can you tell me about some of the great things that came out of Persia, like the alphabet? Or how about the refrigerator? Or how about the battery? Yeah, these are all inventions that came out of Persia, modern-day Iran. We hardly know anything about that country. In fact, we hardly know anything about that region of the world. What can you tell me about the Middle East? Do you even know that Iran is not Arabian? Yeah, it's Persian, but it's in the middle of the Middle East. Most people think of the Middle East as a scary place. They think of it as war-torn, and believe me, there's plenty of conflict there. They think of it as scary and backwards, with women wearing garb that hides their very obvious facial body parts. So we know very little about the Middle East and about Iran and about that whole region. There's a reason for that, and that's because of some of the media policies that have been in existence across the world that put certain parts of the world at at arm's length, that make it inaccessible to us. The same can be said of Africa and Asia, for that matter, and even South America. So this chapter takes on policy and governance of media. It takes on a subject in a very detailed way, and it's easy to get lost in the details, and it's actually my job today not to go over those details, but to try and give a broader picture to set the context to help explain what this chapter is trying to get at. And I will say that this is one of the few times in the course where both readings are going to align quite nicely. That is to say, the reading for today, as well as the text reading that you're going to get on Thursday that's going to be on D2L, which talks about regulation, because regulation is very much related to policy and governance. So let's try and make sense of our chapter so that you can proceed with a really solid post today as part of your assignment. So let's talk first about some introductory comments. We want to say that when we talk about policy, we're really talking about a blueprint that is offered by the stakeholders who are involved in setting up media systems in countries. In our last class, we talked about how philosophies are guiding the way that countries are thinking that their media systems should operate, and policy is just the way that those philosophies are being operationalized, the way that those policies are being put into force in a blueprint for how that country should operate. And the policies that we talk about really reflect power relations amongst the major players. We have the state. When we talk about the state, that's a term that we don't use that often in our culture, but it really refers to the governing body of a country. And that governing body can be made up of government, can be made up of religion, can even be made up of corporate interests. That's the state. So that's what we're talking about here. Generally speaking, countries, if they have developed policies, have tried to develop policies that promote quote-unquote good media content. Now, you can argue over what good media content is, but that's generally been the disposition in formulating policies to set up media systems. One of the tensions that has existed is the difference between media policies that encourage nationalistic content versus internationalistic content. Nationalistic content makes you be proud to be an American, proud to be a UK citizen, proud to be a Canadian. We'll study what that's like when we go to Canada this week, those of us who are in this class who are going there. Nationalism is beyond patriotism. It's really starting to view other countries as lesser than the country that you're in, that your country is better than others. It's bigger, it's more powerful, it's greater. We even refer to our country as the greatest country in the world. I mean, how silly is that? I have a column on that in Rounding Some Corners, by the way. How silly is it? It's like saying, who's the greatest brother in your family? It doesn't make sense. Every country is great in some way. It just depends on what dimension you want to look at. Internationalism has to do with what we all have in common in terms of our existence on this earth. You can look at climate change as an example of something that all countries are struggling with in one way or another, to say, you know what, we all have to band together to make sure that we don't ruin this planet. And so internationalism is sometimes at odds with nationalism, which is trying to focus on the particular needs of a particular country and saying that your country has superiority over other countries. So it's in this context we start to study policy. And the book makes a point of saying that the old way of looking at media policy is breaking down. And the old way can be envisioned in actually the book that I wrote, Comparative Media Systems. It's sort of an old way, which is why the book has gone out of print. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't study it because new media policy has to build on old media policy as it evolves. But the old media policy was based on what we consider to be comparative media systems. And what that is saying, the old media policy, is looking at policy in terms of a different kind of media world where each country could really control the kinds of media that were set up in that country, the media system. In other words, the boundaries or the borders of that country, the physical geography of that country made it possible for the US to keep things within, or China to keep things within. And so within that old framework of thinking, we used to look at media as being governed by the philosophies that we studied in the last chapter. We would say that a country would have a closer orientation to an authoritarian philosophy, or would have a closer orientation towards a communist philosophy, and thereby all the media would be governed by policies that are keeping the media within the framework of the boundaries of the country and the policies that are developed. But that's no longer really a valid way of trying to understand policy amongst media primarily because of technology. The borders today are almost inconsequential when it comes to media because media are able to escape those borders. I mean, the infrastructure of satellite and cable television, just to look at one example, makes it possible to shoot those programs right out of the United States, and also makes it possible for you, let's say that you come from immigrants from Egypt, and you want to get Egyptian programming, you can do that by satellite television. And so today's borderless countries, if you want to look at them that way, in terms of the infrastructure of media extending beyond those borders, really makes that old way of looking at media policy, comparative media systems, not as relevant as it used to be. So what we're having is an emergence of a new global media policy. It's still being formulated. I said at the outset of this class that this book is still trying to figure out what global media studies is. That's the study of global media policy, but the global media philosophy in and of itself is an emerging way of looking at how media are controlled and operated across the world. And so we can say that when we look at the new way of looking at global media policy, one of the shifts that has been happening, which talks about later in the chapter, I want to mention it now because it's relevant, is that the public ownership of broadcasters and state-run broadcasting, or public broadcasting, it has been known in some countries, has been given away to privately owned commercial broadcasters. Which is to say, if you were to look at Europe in the 1940s, German television was mostly publicly funded. British television, publicly funded. French television, publicly funded. That means the government is owning the TV programs and distributing the TV programs. Same for radio. And that's shifted. The government has tried to get out of the business of funding and controlling, in most countries, trying to get out of the business of funding media and trying to hand that over to the free market. So that's a big shift that's taking place. So we still have that tension, though, which the book identifies as a tension between trade and liberalization as a paradigm for looking at global media policy. That's where we're saying let the market decide. That's where liberalization is all about, hands-off, freedom. We've discussed that under the libertarian philosophy. And that's a tension, the trade and liberalization paradigm is at odds with, this is where the tension comes in, with the other way of looking at global media policy, and that's multilateral cooperation, which is being reborn, the chapter says. And that's where countries together are trying to work out differences, and they're doing that through trade agreements. And so speaking of trade agreements, we have the rise of transnational policy. And transnational policy is policy that's being arrived at through trade agreements between different countries or between different sectors of the world. One of those policies is NAFTA, the North America Free Trade Agreement, which was put into place by Bill Clinton. And the Trump administration is trying to dismantle that and has actually negotiated a new agreement between Mexico and Canada. I think what they're calling is the Mexican-Canadian-U.S. Trade Agreement. I can't remember the name of it. But if you look at NAFTA, what it did was it set the rules for how products could be manufactured and traded. That means where they could be manufactured in a country and whether there would be restrictions on how they're traded, because trade is controlled, right? We don't just have a free marketplace. Like, you can't just buy grain from China for your food products. There are controls on that so that American farmers are not at a disadvantage. With China dumping a bunch of grain on the market. And China's not a great example. It's not a grain exporter, but a country like India would be an example of that, rice being a grain. So that same principle applies to media products as well, right? So NAFTA has actually made it possible for two big Mexican media conglomerates, Televisa and sorry, not Televisa, Grupo Televisa and Grupo stands for Group, and Grupo Azteca. So the North American Free Trade Agreement has actually opened up the possibility for those countries through subsidies and through relaxation of taxes and tariffs for those products, chiefly the telenovela, which is a TV program that's a soap opera that's different from American soap operas in many ways. It has a very clear distinction between good and bad in the characters, and many times you have a class clash that is at the basis of the romance. So you have a female who comes from a poor family and a Mexican male who comes from a richer family, and they are in love, but they can't get together because of families. That's the basis of a telenovela. That has been made very easy to be imported into the United States because of NAFTA, North American Free Trade Agreement. Similarly, in the EU, we have the European Union is that combination of countries that belong to the EU. That's what Britain's Brexit is all about. It's trying to get out of the EU next month. And the EU also has set up different rules and policies for how TV programs and newspapers and web can be distributed across Europe. And there's this agreement they came up with, a Television Without Frontiers, which tries to treat Europe as a complete national market, 480 million people actually, as opposed to just the French market or the Belgian market or the Spanish market or the Italian market. So it allows television to flow freely, to be exported across those countries. So here we have a new way of looking at a global media policy. Is going beyond borders, right? That's what we're trying to study global media policy from that vantage point. Now, the rest of the chapter goes into a detailed discussion of several dimensions of Arabic and Middle Eastern media policy. And it does that in part because one of the authors is very well acquainted with this, but also because it's trying to prove the point that we know so little about the Arab world. We know so little about the Middle Eastern world, which also includes Persia, Iran, which is not Arab. So there are various detailed policies that are discussed in the rest of the chapter. Don't get too hung up on knowing what those policies are. But for example, the ASTC, which was formed in 2008, is the Arab Satellite Television Charter. And it's trying to seize control of satellite policy across Arabia to try and ensure, essentially, that those countries have internal control over the programming, the TV programming that comes into the Middle East, because a lot of those countries have regimes. Regimes are not elected governments. They are passed down from one ruler to the next, often through royalty, as is the case in Saudi Arabia. You have the royal Saud family. But it's also the case in Syria, where you just have family passing down. The president, Bashar, is the son of the former president, and that's the way it goes in the Middle East. So a lot of the satellite policy is designed to prevent foreign imports coming in and changing the ideas of those nations that you should actually have a democratically elected politic body politic that can change the government if it wants, and that there's no rightful succession from one ruler to another. So that policy was designed really to ensure that the governments that already have control over their countries maintain that control when it was under the guise, that policy, of opening up satellite programming to the rest of the world. Similarly, when we look at Saudi media policy, which is next discussed in the book, there's a TV service that's been launched to promote national policy making, to bring national unity to the country, to make sure that the dissension does not take place. And most of the dissension in those countries is a religious dissension. Even amongst Muslims, you have various factions that are in opposition to each other and cannot coexist. We have that here in the United States as well. You can say that, for example, Catholicism is not compatible with Unitarianism on the dimension of abortion, for example. Now, does it show itself in terms of the two sides clashing at each other and pressing the U.S. government not to allow anti-abortion ads to be placed on television or on the web or in newspapers? No, we don't have that. But in the Arab world, you have those religious factions that are so devout that a lot of times the countries are paralyzed, and Saudi Arabia is one of those, and that's why they have this policy. The book also takes a look at Lebanon. Lebanon, very tiny country. It was known as sort of the welcome mat. That's the way I think of it, to the Far East, because you have all these European powers. And if you take a look at a map, you should take a look at a map and you see how tiny Lebanon is. It's only like 28 miles long. You can have radio that goes from one end to the other, no problem. It was a welcome mat to get across the Mediterranean and to go to the Far East, to the riches of the Far East, the teas and the spices in India, and the China, to get to the Far East, the mysticism of China. You got to go through Lebanon. So a lot of countries went through Lebanon, conquered it, stepped on it, overran it. And today, Lebanon is a country that's very multicultural, very multidimensional. In fact, if you want to be a French citizen, I blew my point here. If you want to be a Lebanese citizen who has high status, you speak French, right? That's seen as a good thing. Unlike in the United States, you speak Spanish. That doesn't give you any sort of natural high credibility, but in Lebanon, it does. So Lebanon was influenced by this horrific civil war that took 15 years. In our country, we had a civil war. It took 4 years, and we know the damages of that. We got Gettysburg right here in Pennsylvania, where brothers fought alongside each other. But in Lebanon, you had a 15-year civil war, and since Lebanon is so tiny, you had a lot of surrounding countries which are intervening and funding the war, with armaments and supplies and training. And so you had a lot of different countries, Iran, Syria, with their hands in that Lebanese war. And what grew out of it was a law called the Audiovisual Media Law, and it was supposed to be solidifying Lebanese media policy to make Lebanon media have control of their own destiny. But really what it ended up doing is it gave exclusive rights to Tele-Liban, which is the leading state-run television. And what it also did was it aligned a lot of the media properties in Lebanon with politicians. They had vested interests. They invested in the media channels, the TV programs, newspapers, television. And so there's a lot of corruption in Lebanon. TV licenses are tied directly to politicians in Lebanon. And then you have, next in the chapter, it talks about the United Arab Emirates, the UAE. Do you even know these countries? Have you even heard of them before? Do you know what an emirate is? Yeah, it's a bunch of kingdoms, and it's all united, kind of like the states we live in, the United States. I think sometimes we forget there were 50 individual states that are being united. Similar thing here in the UAE. And what we have here is it basically granted independence to each emirate, each county, if you want to think of it that way, in the United Arab Emirates. So when we look at the back end of this chapter, what this chapter is saying when it comes to the Middle East is the Arab states really have developed what the book calls abuse-prone media policies. That means the policies are designed to allow the countries to have their own autonomy over their own media policy, to be able to determine that policy. But really what it's done is it's strengthened the hand. A lot of those controlling interests that already have the media under their thumb. And so it's contrary to what the policies are supposed to do. But still, we know that the boundaries are artificial. Geographic boundaries are artificial. That's why we've had revolutions in Egypt where the ruler was thrown out. The Facebook revolution, so-called, because of the social media permeating that culture, and that culture not really able to keep it out despite it having boundaries and policies against it. So as we head into this new world, trying to take a look at how media policy it gets fleshed out in terms of regulation, which will continue when we get to our discussion on Thursday, we're looking at a brand new world where borderless communication is taking place and mass communication is taking place. Content is circulating all over the world, whether countries want it to or not. And so is that going to cause countries to have stronger hands in media policy? That's yet to be seen. In the meantime, have a great day.